From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole, Director of the Center for the Book in the Library, and I'm going to start our introduction as soon as we get a few more people seated under special seating rules for today. This table is available for people to sit on if you would like. And I think we're going to have one seat up here. But if those of you who need to stand, also good standing room here is actually against that wall behind where we're selling the books. Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry. And here's one seat right up here. Anyone near a seat that is untaken? Okay, there's one here. One lone soul, please. Well, thank you. This is the best we can do. It's a privilege to be here with such a popular speaker, friends of Betty Eisenstein. It's a wonderful day for us at the Library of Congress, and we're looking forward to the debut of Betty's wonderful new book, Divine Art, Infernal Machine, The Reception of Printing in the West from First Impressions to the Sense of an Ending. There's a story behind that title, and I know we're going to hear it. The Center for the Book was created in 1977 to stimulate public interest in books and reading. It was created by Daniel Borston, and Elizabeth Eisenstein was on our first board of directors. We'll say a word about that in a couple of minutes. The center today has Centers for the Book affiliates in every state. Plus DC, plus the Virgin Islands as we're moving into the U.S. territories. We promote books and reading locally and authors through those state centers. We also have more than 80 nonprofit organizations nationally and internationally with which we work to promote books and reading. Here at the Library of Congress, one of the major projects in which we participate is the National Book Festival. We're responsible basically for the author program and also for the Pavilion of the States, where if you've come to the book festival, you know that's a busy place where each state has tables and talks about how it promotes books and reading at the local level. Here at the Library of Congress, we're proud to be sponsors of this particular lecture series, normally at noon, today later in the afternoon. And this Books and Beyond series features books that have some kind of special relationship to the Library of Congress. New books, books that are drawing on our collections, or books that have a connection through a project or perhaps through a personality who's worked with us for a number of years. I would like to thank the Humanities and Social Sciences Division of the Library of Congress for helping to co-sponsor this talk. Our speaker will begin with a presentation followed by questions and answers. That will take about the first hour. A book signing will follow. All of our talks are videotaped for later presentation on the Library of Congress's website. And during the question and answer period, if you choose to ask a question, you're giving us permission to perhaps be part of our webcast at a later time. Right now, around 250 Books and Beyond talks are available on the Library of Congress website, in addition to around 650 talks from the National Book Festival. So by going to the Book Festival website or the Library of Congress's website, you indeed can get a snapshot of not only contemporary authors, but also how resources are being used throughout our country to produce books on such a wonderful variety of topics. The Center for the Book's basic task is to promote books and reading, and when we can combine good friends, the use of the library's collections, and good scholarship, and at the Book Festival, programming for young people as well, we are very happy. The Center for the Book's latest venture within the Library of Congress is the Young Readers Center, which has been opened in the Jefferson Building and is aimed at people under 16 as long as they bring an adult with them. And it's a wonderful read aloud project area, media room, and place where we also feature the video cast from the National Book Festival. Many of you know Elizabeth Eisenstein. She has been a friend of the Library of Congress for many years. As I hinted, it began before the Center for the Book was created, and we were created in 1977. But Betty, through the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, and a former chief who many of you will remember, William Matheson, created a series of lectures on the book. It was supported by Mrs. Charles Engelhard. When the Center for the Book was created, Bill Matheson in many ways was a savior for the Center for the Book because we had me and that was about it. And we were looking for programming, ways to promote books and reading, and it was Bill's suggestion that we collaborate on the Engelhard lecture series. And one of Elizabeth Eisenstein's talks very early on became a staple because at that time she was just getting started on the book that most of us know her for. She actually, I want to get this right. Today she is Professor Emerita of History at the University of Michigan. Back in the 70s, after the center was created, she was our very first scholar in residence for the Center for the Book, and I have proof. This is a little piece on the origins of the Center for the Book, and here is a photograph of a young Elizabeth Eisenstein at the typewriter, professor at the University of Michigan, and author, of course, by then, of the printing press as an agent of change. She was spending, it was noted here by the author, the first 6 months of 1979 at the Library of Congress as the Center for the Book's first resident scholar. We've only had 2 since then, so in many ways, she was pioneer there as well. Betty is best known, of course, for her major opus, which I mentioned, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, Communications and Cultural Transformation in Early Modern Europe, which was published in that same year, in 1979. Her other books include Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe, in 1983, and Grub Street Abroad, Aspects of the French Cosmopolitan Press from the Age of Louis XIV to the French Revolution in 1992. I love to hold books up. This book, actually, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in association with the Center for the Book, and it's titled, and it's about Betty and her work, Agent of Change, Print Culture Studies After Elizabeth Eisenstein, which was edited by Sabrina Alcorn-Barron, Eric Lindquist, and Eleanor Shevlin, and I know at least Eleanor is here. Are Eric or Sabrina here as well? Betty has been an important inspiration for many, many young scholars in the field of the history of the book, myself included, but also, of course, including many of you. And in addition, of course, the effort that went to putting this together was considerable and is itself an indication of the high esteem in which Betty as a person and Betty as a scholar is held here in Washington, D.C. We're very lucky to have her with us today. I will say one more thing about the Center for the Book series, of which this is a part. We also have a Facebook page. You can learn more about what talks we have presented and what talks we will present, as well as Betty's talk, by going to our Facebook page, and I'm certain that after this talk is over, it will be filled with comments, wonderful comments about our speaker who's plunging off into a new approach to an old topic, which she's going to tell us all about. It's my pleasure to present Elizabeth Eisenstein. Betty?
Now, have to adjust the mic. Can you hear me way back there?
The answer is yes.
Way back there. You can't hear. The mic is not on?
Just speak up, Betty, and it will be fine. Okay?
I have a fairly loud voice, but that's funny that it isn't.
Let's just plunge ahead, okay?
All right. I'm surprised. No, okay. John plunged ahead, and then he fixed it.
I plunged this ahead.
Thank you for your very nice introduction. I'm very pleased to participate in the library's Books and Beyond program. The Beyond in the program title fits in nicely with my long-held view that the study of books needs to be supplemented by the study of printed materials. Of course, the two fields converge, but they also diverge. Book history encompasses thousands of years before Gutenberg, beginning with the papyrus roll and going on to the codex and the many centuries of hand copying. Print culture encompasses a much shorter interval, but it includes a much wider variety of formats, such as playing cards and sales receipts, timetables, and many other kinds of non-books. The work that is featured today surveys reactions toward printing in the Western world, starting with Gutenberg's contemporaries and ending in the present multimedia age. For this talk, I'm not going to follow a chronological progression, but I'm going to hop, skip, and jump over the past 500 years in order to sample some of the reactions expressed by various groups who lived in different times. I'm going to start with a split screen, first slide, please, showing the two contrasting images that inspired my book title, Divine Art, Infernal Machine. And the book jacket illustrator has attempted to interpret it. You can see the white and the black very clearly wherever you are. Divine, infernal. Probably infernal should be red, but it's black. Divine Art, Infernal Machine. The top is the spirit of printing, and the bottom is Grub Street from the Grub Street Journal. Both images, both of these split images, appeared during the same decade in the 18th century. The one that places the press in the heavens is the frontispiece of a commemorative volume of 1740 celebrating the 300th anniversary of the invention. It was composed by Prosper Marchand, who had been a privileged printer in Paris before he converted to Protestantism in the 1700s and left France for the Netherlands, where he remained until his death in 1756. Now, the next slide. This is the full frontispiece, and it's titled, the other was just a segment of the frontispiece showing the press in the heavens. This is the full frontispiece, which is titled, The Spirit of Printing Descending from the Heavens. The Spirit's drapery, I think you can't see it from over there anyway, can you? Oh, gee. Well, you'll have to use your imagination, I guess. When you buy the book, the illustration is there. The Spirit's drapery. The Spirit is in the heavens, and her drapery is decorated with letters. The vowels are in her crown, and she's holding a wooden hand press. In her descent from the heavens, she's escorted by Minerva, goddess of wisdom, and Mercury, messenger of the gods. And she's then entrusted, this is the point I wanted to show visually, entrusted to representatives of 5 European nations. Each nation holds a medallion depicting celebrated early printers. Germany holds Gutenberg and Faust. Holland holds Coster. England, of course, holds a medallion with the portrait of Caxton on it. The grouping of nations and the selection of printers' portraits reflects the author's particular view of printing history, with the three Protestant nations, Germany, Holland, and England, grouped together, and the two Catholic countries, Italy and France, on the opposite side. The printer on the medallion held by France is Robert Etienne, who had started out as a privileged French royal printer, but fell out of favor when his scholarly editions of the Latin Bible were censured by the Sorbonne. He left Paris for Protestant Geneva, which endeared him to Marchand, who had left Paris for the Protestant Dutch Netherlands. The other image, next slide please, is obviously anti-commemorative. And you don't get much on the cover of the jacket, but you will see it if you open the book. This image ran in a satirical London weekly of 1732, issued by the Scriblarians, a group of disaffected literati who included Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. They resented the Hanoverian dynasty, the Whig ascendancy, and above all, local booksellers. The caricature depicts a London printing shop where workers with the heads of beasts labor under the direction of a two-faced master printer and a bookseller wearing a monstrous mask. The accompanying text makes fun of commemorative histories. Instead of presenting master printers, it offers a mock history of how grimy boys came to be called printers' devils. The two-faced printer is called Janus, and he's two-faced in every sense of the word. When a customer asks how the book is selling, he replies, "Extremely well." When an author asks the same question, he replies, "Very indifferently." The owl in Marchand's image accompanies Minerva, or Athena, goddess of wisdom and patroness of printing. In the Grub Street cartoon, the owl is the weak-sighted and stupid companion of dullness who presides over Pope's Dunciad. The owl, by the way, is sitting on top of a bookshelf in that slide, in that image. I have several pictures of owls, by the way, on top of piles of books on an ass and so forth in the images in the book. By placing printing in the heavens, Marchand was echoing views expressed by late 15th century churchmen who had first coined the phrase divine art. But his grouping of nations and selection of printers to commemorate reflected later religious divisions. Among Protestants, the invention was assigned a leading role in emancipating Luther's followers from the rule of the Pope. The Grub Street caricature reflects a very different perspective on printing. It entailed not emancipation from the Roman Pope, but the enslavement of authors to the profiteering bookseller. All the world agrees, the Grub Street text says, that the publisher's only god is Mammon. The juxtaposition of the two images conveys a sense of ambivalence that is often attributed to Western attitudes in general. As is suggested by Kurt Buehler's comment, printing was regarded as a blessing and a curse, sometimes as both at once. The phrase blessing and curse was applied to printing by a 15th century scholar. Ambivalence is also evident in the myths about the earliest printers, Gutenberg, the inventive genius, his financier Faust, evil sorcerer confused with Dr. Faustus, Faust and Faustus being spelled at that particular time in the same way. His financier Faust was either an evil sorcerer or a greedy malefactor. Still, to stop short with the polarities, blessing, curse, divine, infernal, is to neglect all that lies in between. We turn off the slides, thank goodness. Such dichotomies do not do justice to the complex attitudes that can't be conveyed in single images. The views of an 18th century author such as Alexander Pope are likely to be misconstrued if we stop short with a Grub Street caricature. There were two popes, writes Breen Hammond, the Pope who loved print and the Pope who hated it. The anti-print Pope loathed scandal sheets, pamphlets, scholarly editions, boring poems, most plays, critics, and, above all, booksellers. The other Pope was fixated on print, loved its looks, played with all its devices, ran his own press, and promoted his own editions and poems. Similarly, Marchand's engraving was at odds with Marchand's own reactions to the printer of his day. Soon after leaving France for the Netherlands, he found the cutthroat competition in Holland so dismaying that he gave up printing and publishing altogether. As an author, he complained about the lazy, incompetent workers who'd failed to get his book ready in time for the anniversary celebration of printing that was held at the Frankfurt Fair of 1740. When he paid tribute to printing, it was not to his contemporary printers, but rather to the earliest Renaissance masters who are portrayed on medallions in his frontispiece. The glorification of these celebrated early masters was a big feature of 18th century discourse. Addison poked fun at Tom Folio, who esteemed Aldous and Elsevier more than Virgil and Horace. But the article on printers in L'Encyclopédie by Diderot's chief collaborator did not joke about the lost golden age of typography, but took it very seriously. Biographical sketches describe early printers who were martyred for their faith or who managed to produce perfect, error-free editions. This incredible feat is attributed to Marchand's special hero, Robert Etienne, who died in Geneva. Etienne is said by Jaucourt to have achieved perfect, error-free editions by the ingenious device of posting proofs on college walls and offering to reward any student who discovered any error. Doesn't seem very likely, does it? Another of Jaucourt's sketches describes a printer who spent millions on his editions but died poor. It ends with the comment, "Once printing was glorious, now it's nothing but a mercenary craft." Of course, printing had always been a mercenary craft, and there were no perfect, error-free early editions. As is so often the case, the best of the past was exaggerated to show off, by contrast, the worst of the present. While acknowledging that many authors expressed discontent with the printers of their day, it's also worth noting that positive views of Gutenberg's invention outweighed negative ones among Western Europeans. This was true from the start, that is, during the first decades after Gutenberg. In the 15th century, according to Martin Lowry, there was an immense range of individual opinions. All can be placed somewhere between committed acclamation and absolute rejection. But even this seemingly cautious verdict may be too simple. There certainly was a wide range of individual opinions, and there certainly is ample evidence of committed acclamation. But there's almost no evidence of absolute rejection. I can think of two instances. Francois-Xavier temporarily banned printing in France in 1535. Two governors did the same thing in colonial Virginia during the later 17th century. Both actions were relatively inconsequential. Neither occurred in the 15th century. There were a few individuals in that century who expressed the desire to see printing rejected. Unlike other manuscript book dealers, who were more adaptable, Vespasiano da Bisticci closed his shop when printing came into Florence. He then wrote his memoirs. He wrote that the Duke of Urbino would have been ashamed to have had a printed book in the ducal library. His memoirs went unpublished until the 19th century when they attracted the attention of Jacob Burckhardt. Thereafter, patrician disdain for printed books became a textbook commonplace. Yet it was shown long ago that this account was untrustworthy. In the Urbino Library, printed books were beautifully bound and placed alongside of hand-copied ones. Recently, more attention has been given to the contrarian friar Filippo di Strata, whose diatribe against Venetian printers was discovered in the early 1900s. The friar expressed his disgust at the flooding of book markets with sensational stories that corrupted the minds of, quote, tender boys and gentle girls. The respectable art of writing was being degraded by the brothel of print. The pen is a virgin, the press a whore. His colorful denunciation has become prominent in recent studies, but his diatribe had little effect in its day. His plea that printing be banned from Venice went unheeded. The authorities were not inclined to banish such a flourishing industry from the Republic. As these examples suggest, to find absolute rejection or even any effective, long-lasting ban on printing, we must look outside the West to the Ottoman Empire. There, printing not just the Quran, but any Arabic text was forbidden, and the ban remained in effect throughout the empire for several centuries after Gutenberg. Parenthetically, I think this prolonged and effective ban on the printing of any Arabic text deserves much more attention than it has yet received. With regard to Western attitudes, the term infernal machine may be misleading, for it was often applied to gunpowder and cannonry and contrasted with the letterpress. Although the new weaponry was considered useful for countering the Turkish threat, it was also condemned as being diabolical. Destructive weapons that had emerged from the lower depths were frequently contrasted with the divine art that had come down from the heavens. Unlike Muslim authorities, Western churchmen had no hesitation about applying typography to their most sacred texts. One of the earliest documents recording an enthusiastic reception of a printed Bible comes from a letter written by a future pope to a cardinal. One of the earliest uses of the phrase, divine art, comes in an editorial preface to a Roman edition of the Letters of St. Jerome. The preface writer, a churchman, described his master, Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, as being, quote, delighted that this divine art was being introduced from Germany into Italy. This editorial preface, like many others that paid tribute to typography, came from a printing shop. Given its venue, one is not surprised to find that it expressed admiration for the invention. But one is surprised at how often such prefaces are overlooked by the authorities, excuse me, who argue that 15th century scholars did not differentiate between pen work and press work. This argument is based partly on the fact that both hand-copied and printed books were placed side by side, sometimes in identical bindings, in shops and on shelves. The argument relies mainly on the use of the same Latin terms, liber, codex, to describe both pen work and press work. But philology is not a good guide to such issues. The frequent misuse of the term typescript to describe a manuscript on one hand, a hard copy on the other, doesn't indicate our inability to distinguish between handwriting, typewriting, and word processing. References to an iron horse didn't mean that people confused animals with locomotives. Similarly, the use of the same terms for hand-copied and printed products did not indicate failure to distinguish between the two. Many 15th century prefaces underline the difference between the hand-copied and the printed text. For instance, a preface to a 1475 edition of Ovid explains why printed books are superior to hand-copied ones. Quote, "The text runs through all the copies, always in the same order, with scarcely a possibility of error, a thing which in a manuscript is apt to result very differently." Modern-day scholars who stress the incapacity of the hand press to produce the truly standard editions we're familiar with now, modern-day scholars may dismiss this opinion as naive and misleading. The fact remains that a 15th century scholar believed it to be true, and in so doing, he clearly distinguished between manuscript copy and printed edition. As we might expect, some of the most emphatic tributes to the new art came from the printers themselves. Often the rhetoric that was employed simply echoed earlier writings in praise of scribes. But this was not the case with the content of colophons, that is, the informal comments made by scribes or by printer at the end or the beginning of the text that was being duplicated. Against scribal complaints about frozen fingers and cramped hands may be set the claims of printers about the superiority of their new tools. Quote, "Who dares to glorify the pen-made book when so much better metal-stamped letters look?" That's Pollard's translation of a 1470 Latin colophon. In addition to the somewhat self-serving comments of preface writers and printers, there were the actions of influential officials, actions that spoke more loudly than words. In 1470, the rector of the Sorbonne, together with a college librarian, invited 3 German printers to come to Paris to set up the very first French press within college precincts. We may assume that these 2 academic officials thought the services of printers were different from, and indeed preferable to, those of scribes. The rector's often cited tribute leaves no room for doubt on the matter. Quote, "Bacchus and Ceres were made divinities for having taught humanity the use of wine and bread. Gutenberg's invention is of a higher and more divine order. It enables all that has been thought and said to be preserved and transmitted to posterity." German printers had set up presses in Italy before they did so in France. Their presence in both countries was marked enough to provoke Venetian grumbling about foreign interlopers and a French reference to a Trojan horse. But German priority was a source of immense satisfaction to northern literati. Until the mid-15th century, Italian claims to cultural superiority for having recovered the lost treasures of antiquity and for having revived true Latin eloquence had gone virtually unchallenged. Italian claims had gone virtually unchallenged. That the divine art had been born north of the Alps enabled the Germans, who'd been accused of barbarism, enabled the Germans to mount a counterattack. One much-published chronicle, first issued in 1483, assigned Gutenberg's invention to the year 1440. While thus fixing the year for all later centennial celebrations, the chronicler added, "It is beyond the power of words to express how much students of letters owe to the Germans." Thus, even before Luther celebrated printing as a God-given means of emancipation from the rule of Italian popes, the invention was being integrated into a triumphal historical narrative based on long-standing cultural rivalries. The abundance of celebratory rhetoric from northern humanists, from Italian prelates, from all manners of scholars and craftsmen has led one authority to dismiss all talk of ambivalence. It's abundantly clear, he writes, that from the earliest days of their appearance, printed books were considered and accepted as a great success. But here again is a sweeping verdict that needs to be qualified. There's little evidence of absolute rejection. There's much of committed acclamation. But commentators were not always single-minded about the new presses. Initial enthusiasm can be documented, but so can subsequent disillusion and disappointment. Negative views are not hard to find. What needs more attention is that these views were most often directed not at the new art itself, not at printing, but at its unworthy practitioners, at the mess the printers made. There's a difference between objecting to error-filled editions and repudiating the art of printing. Conrad Leontorius attacked ignorant, careless printers, but he was not rejecting printing, which he called a divine art. He was rather deploring the way it was being abused. He went on to compliment his friend Johann Amerbach of Basel on Amerbach's superior editions. In their actual dealings with early printers, authors rarely maintained a consistent attitude. They often began by expressing gratitude, only to end by finding fault. Perhaps the most celebrated example of inconstancy was provided by Erasmus, who was liable to change printers whenever it might be advantageous to his career. In 1508, he paid an extravagant tribute to the Venetian master printer Aldus Manutius for serving not merely a single generation or a single province, but all the peoples of the entire world and all the generations to come. In a later colloquy, however, the same printer was assigned the uninspiring role of a deferential son-in-law who catered to his stingy and miserly father-in-law, the printer Andrea Assola. In his later years, especially after the Lutheran revolt cost him former friends and admirers, Erasmus adopted a sour tone when he wrote about the press. A late version of the same adage that had glorified Aldus and his library without walls complained about the swarms of new books that were glutting the market and the way once venerated older authors were being neglected. Negative views were not confined to outbursts from concerned scholars and ambitious authors. Adverse comments also came from the printers themselves in the course of denigrating competitors. Quote, "Buy these volumes and you'll be right in reckoning other editions to be worth no more than a straw," advertised a Basel printer in 1494. On the negative side also were the frequent attacks made on the printing workers who served their masters as convenient scapegoats. A colophon 1494 in a history of Bologna told readers that whatever faults were to be found were due not to the master printer, who was a man of exceptional ability. The faults were due rather to the ineptitude of his workers. The carelessness and incompetence of journeyman typographers often infuriated authors. Not that they'd been previously more pleased with the work of scribes. Scribes were called the excrement of the universe by Poggio Bracciolini. Nevertheless, the reckless, roistering habits of printing workers were evoked by Sebastian Brandt and his Ship of Fools in a way that anticipated numerous later accounts of the disorderly crews who manned the wooden hand press. Such accounts are certainly at odds with allusions to the divine art, to a divine art. As recent historians continue to remind us, real printing shops were noisy, dirty, and smelly, all attributes that seem to be incompatible with Christian ideas of the divine. The description of printing as a divine art, however, had little to do with working conditions inside often crowded shops. It was related rather to the number of man-hours that were saved when text no longer had to be copied out by hand. The merits of the hand press as a labor-saving device were repeatedly emphasized in writings that pointed to the superiority of the moderns over the ancients, writings that elaborated on ideas of progress. Now I'm moving back to the 18th century. Think of the progress that has been made in the sciences and the arts. Think of the many truths that were unveiled today which were not dreamed of then. wrote d'Alembert in his preliminary discourse to the 18th century encyclopédie. His pleased amazement was coupled with a dismissal of the useless Latin learning of Renaissance scholars and belittling comments about previous works of reference that had failed to incorporate recent advances in fields such as mathematics and physics. No doubt, this repudiation of outdated reference works and enthusiasm for recent progress was self-serving. To impress prospective subscribers with the desirability of a new encyclopedia, the obsolescence of previous ones needed to be made clear. It would be odd indeed to find a publisher or editor informing potential purchasers that their new reference work was inferior to previous ones. Nevertheless, d'Alembert was also expressing personal convictions. As a mathematician himself, he was fully cognizant of the remarkable achievements of such figures as Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton. His fellow editor, Diderot, was also alert to advances in the mathematical sciences, but he was even more intent on improvements in the mechanical arts. He belittled previous encyclopedias for relying too much on other books and not enough on investigating improvements in workshop routines. His enthusiasm for artisanal labor was accompanied by a devaluation of the liberal arts. Quote, "The liberal arts have sung their own praise long enough. They should now raise their voice in praise of the mechanical arts and free the mechanical arts from the degradation in which they have so long been held by prejudice." Of course, there was one mechanical art that was especially well suited to singing its own praise. L'Encyclopédie famously devoted many articles and illustrations to the printing arts. Its technical section was composed by the foreman of its printing shop. Thus, printers continued to publicize the merits of their craft, much as had been the case 300 years earlier. But 18th century tributes emanated from other venues as well. At least since the days of Lutheran pamphleteering, the power attributed to print had become enmeshed in religious and political controversy. As already noted, 16th century Lutherans credited Gutenberg's invention with providing a weapon that John Huss and other anti-papists had lacked. After Luther, printing was hailed as an indispensable weapon in the struggle against bishops and kings by 17th century English regicides. Explosions of pamphleteering on both sides of the channel led alarmed officials. But despite their harsh measures, paper bullets, as they were called, were sent both from abroad and from hidden presses at home, and they managed to reach disenfranchised readers. By the mid-18th century, there was general agreement that printing had given rise to public opinion as a new force in political affairs. Writers such as Voltaire, when seeking to rectify miscarriages of justice, bypassed appeals to duly constituted authorities and instead put their case before the reading public at large. In 1775, the director of the French book trade observed, "He lived in an enlightened century when each citizen could speak to the entire nation by means of the printing press." Celebrating the expansion of the political arena reached a climax during the French Revolution. In September 1792, members of the National Convention received a petition made in the name of all printers. It requested that the remains of Gutenberg be exhumed and placed in the Pantheon. A paraphrased excerpt runs as follows: "If God invented the sun, man invented the printing press. The divinely created sun dissipates physical darkness. The man-made sun vanquishes spiritual darkness. Let us celebrate an inventor who was the first true revolutionary, without whom we would be mute and isolated on Earth. I am always reminded of people who now talk about the World Wide Web equally enthusiastically. The glorification of the invention went together with that of the inventor. This was especially marked in the writings of the Marquis de Condorcet, a mathematician turned politician. He lacked oratorical skill. He associated eloquence and persuasion with trickery. He believed that the widespread use of print would ensure the triumph of rationality in human affairs. To Condorcet and his colleagues, print spelled the end of political systems based on prejudice and superstition, and as well the end of all organized religion. Thanks to the invention, the inhabitants of large modern realms would be able to enjoy the same freedoms as had the citizens of small city-states in antiquity. Condorcet died during the Reign of Terror as a victim of the Jacobins. In less than a decade, the First Republic gave way to the First Empire, and then after Waterloo, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Throughout the continent, under the guidance of Metternich, counter-revolutionary policies were enforced. Nevertheless, optimism about the emancipatory potential of Gutenberg's invention persisted. In France, Republicans and Bonapartists and even Orleanists alike believed that print had set in motion an irreversible process that doomed all attempts at restoring ancien regimes. Across the Channel, similar beliefs were held by opponents of the Tory reaction, who were heartened by the outcome of the American Revolution. The press has come like a true messiah, wrote an English pamphleteer and printer in 1821. The press has come as a true messiah to emancipate mankind from kingly and priestly influence. 19th century references to the press were increasingly likely to refer to the newspaper press. After the industrialization of papermaking, after iron presses had been harnessed to steam, this was first done by the London Times in 1814. After iron presses had been harnessed to steam, old slogans appeared in new guises. Printing was no longer described as a divine art. It was hailed as a mighty engine of progress. The steam-driven output of newsprint was seen not only as undermining efforts to restore ancien regimes, but also as posing an unprecedented threat to the lower-paced production of books. Books were suited to quieter times, wrote Louis Blanc, but we are now in an era when today devours yesterday and will be devoured in turn by tomorrow. Later, Oswald Spengler observed, the newspaper has completely expelled the book from the mental life of people. The people read one paper which is delivered to front doors by millions every day. It spellbinds the intellect from morning till night. It drives the book into oblivion with its more engaging layout. I'm amused by that because people, of course, said the same thing about television and infotainment. Its more engaging layout, it drove the book into oblivion. Just as the age of the sermon had given way to the age of the book, Spengler wrote, so too the age of the book was giving way to that of the newspaper. Hindsight suggests that observers were right to assign special significance to the output of daily newspapers. It created a forum outside parliaments and assembly halls that allowed ordinary readers and letter writers to participate in debates. It provided ambitious journalists, from Marat to Mussolini, with new paths to political power. It gave a tremendous boost to commercial advertising and served to knit together the inhabitants of large cities for whom the daily newspaper would become a kind of surrogate community. Commentators were right to sense that the output of daily papers had significant transformative effects, but they were wrong to assume that the popularity of newspapers signified the end of books. Books and newspapers were not only compatible, they were interdependent. Books were often published in installments that were carried in newspapers. Uncle Tom's Cabin, for instance, was carried in installments. Book sales hinged on newspaper reviews, and of course they still do to a certain extent. Commentators were also wrong to assume that the popularity of newspapers in the 19th and 20th centuries pointed to the decline of books. From the present standpoint, they had the wrong end of the stick. The newspaper, with its urgent deadlines and cumbersome delivery systems, seems more likely than the book to succumb to online publication. Indeed, the probable fate of print journalism is already giving rise to nostalgia for an imagined bygone era of responsible investigation and careful reporting. Of course, books were also subject to nostalgia for a past golden age when print had no rivals, as shown in works such as the Gutenberg Elegies by Sven Bierkarts. Published in 1995, the author prophesied within 10 or 15 years, the world he had known would be utterly changed. In fact, 15 years later, his book was not only still in print, but it was being issued in a new paperback edition. Librarians and archivists are less likely than authors to indulge in nostalgia for a lost age of print culture. I say this in front of quite a few librarians, I suspect. They're more likely to worry about the continuous, relentless pressure exerted by the ever-increasing output of printed materials on available shelf space. The electronic church shows how the sermon, once thought to be outmoded, was capable of being resuscitated. In the present decade, the world's largest bookstore has been opened on the World Wide Web. Indeed, the death of the novel seems somewhat less likely at present than in previous years. There's even a renewed demand for 19th century novels by Jane Austen and Victor Hugo, thanks to recent filmed and televised and staged versions of their works. At present, politicians and celebrities seem to feel that the way to make their mark is not to take advantage of electronic media, but to embark on old-fashioned book tours. Indeed, the last 2 centuries have witnessed not a succession of deaths, not the death of the sermon, of the book, or of the novel. I'm going to omit discussion of the death of the author and the death of God. Not a succession of deaths, but rather a sequence of premature obituaries. In my book, I take note of one such obituary where a late 19th century French bibliophile who had visited Thomas Edison's shop in New Jersey was so impressed by Edison's early recordings that he prophesied not only the end of books, but the end of all printed matter. This was in the 1890s. Of course, simply because such predictions have proved false in the past does not mean that they will not prove true in the future. Printed encyclopedias and dictionaries have already been largely displaced by online ones. Maybe electronic media will monopolize communications once youngsters who are accustomed to rely exclusively on laptops come of age. Right now, however, the total number of books in print increases every year. At present, we live in a multimedia environment. Coexistence, rather than supersession, appears to hold sway. A long-lived example of coexistence, the coexistence of pen work with press work, is going to be offered by the book signing ceremony that follows this talk. If screens ever do completely replace paper pages, authors won't be able to put handwritten signatures upon their texts. I'm glad that that day has not yet arrived. But the time for book signing has to be postponed for a few more minutes. I've been told that a question and answer period should come first. So we're going to open the floor to the question and answer period. Just about right. This is always hard, the first few questions. We're doing well. Hi, Emmett. I didn't see you till now.
I'm thinking of two things.
You'll have to speak up because I'm deaf.
What the signature of a book adds to the value of a book. I'm thinking of a first edition of Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls that I own, and I checked it out for price, and the copy I found on the web was worth $30,000, and actually I jumped out of my chair. But reading the description, it had a dust jacket and a signature. Dropping down to the next copy without a dust jacket, cut it in half, and dropping down to a copy without a signature.
I think
gave
probably
it,
you
gave
can't
it the
hear
value
what
of $100.
Professor Kennedy is saying.
Could you just repeat the question in the mic?
I have to repeat, but this was more than a question. It was about a very special.
The value of
It was about how
handwritten
the
letters
the
as opposed to
value.
print.
He has a copy of Ernest Hemingway's "The Sun Also Rises." Yes.
For whom the bell tolls. Well, I had both, but anyway.
For whom the bell tolls. Excuse me. The sun also rises would be even
The
more.
second example is
For whom the bell.
an error in printing of Graham Greene, a Graham Greene novel. 2 pages were reversed, 121, 151 by the printer. That copy was worth thousands of dollars. The perfect copies were worth hundreds.
Well, he's explaining that the market, this is a very important, I do have quite a riff on the question of markets for antiques as opposed to markets for new books. I mean, and I do think that the market for books is going to continue forever. There's no question about that. But Emmett's point was that a flaw in a first edition, and it's true with flaws in stamps even more, that a flaw in a printed product can raise the price in a market if it's a first edition, because it's a rare commodity. And that's a kind of irony when the printers were trying so hard to produce good standard editions, that when they made errors, the error would be even more market-worthy in the end. But anyway, he also points out that having a jacket, if any of you are collectors, you probably know this, that if you keep the jacket of the book, the price goes up enormously. And that's something, of course, that I guess a lot of us failed to realize. If you were like me, you got rid of jackets too soon. There's somebody
I'm
way
just
up.
hoping that you have a copy with a dust jacket, a signature, and a fall.
Yes.
I wanted to ask a question about the reception of printing in the Jewish community, because ritually to this day, certain texts must be handwritten for ritual use. At the same time, sacred texts are printed in a format leaving space for handwritten commentary. So I didn't know in your study of the history of the acceptance of printing, you had mentioned in the Islamic community whether there were records of its reception in the Jewish community.
Oh, I think one of the very first presses. I'm sorry, this doesn't work terribly well, because I have to
Well, I'll try to
retain.
repeat the question.
I should have a
this time.
mic
Go
I
ahead.
could pass around.
Can I try to speak?
This lady was
I could try to do it. I wanted to ask the question about the reception of printing in the Jewish community, where to this day, certain sacred texts must be handwritten to be ritually used, but at the same time, sacred texts are also printed in a format that leaves room for handwritten commentary.
You had the mix of handwriting and print. But of course, one of the very first printing presses established in Constantinople was a Jewish press. Armenian press, Jewish press were permitted, but it was printing in Arabic that was banned. I mean, that's neither here nor there. But the question is the value put on hand copying as opposed to printing, and the fact there are certain texts in the Jewish community that are not allowed to be printed,
Well, they're allowed to be printed.
or they have to be hand.
For
They have to be, if they're used in ritual, they have to be hand copied, like the scroll, I guess. Yes. Well, this is a very interesting theme to pursue, and I haven't pursued it, which is what is attributed to the hand as opposed to the press, and why certain communities. I mean, to me, it's kind of interesting that the church in the West had no objection whatsoever to having their sacred works printed, and in fact, monasteries would send their manuscripts to the printer to be duplicated, and they wouldn't take back the manuscript once it was printed, which fascinates me, because now, of course, we would consider the manuscript much more worthy than the copy, the duplicate. But so there's a very interesting area to be explored here of the value of the hand as opposed to the press. There's somebody back there.
The part of your title about the Infernal Machine, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what might be considered abuses of the use of the technology. And one example that I think many people might find to be an abuse: Napoleon Bonaparte in Italy hired an Italian printer to travel with his army to prepare paperwork both for his military bureaucracy and propaganda to spread his message to the Italian population. And by the time of the American Civil War, many elements of the Union Army have a traveling printing press in their van to do much the same thing. Propaganda, mechanize the warfare in a sense, and as I said, many people would see this as truly the infernal application of the technology.
Well, I mean, there's the period of the wooden hand press. Of course, you're talking about a later period of the iron press.
Well, by the Civil War, but
By the Civil
Napoleon's
War.
would probably
But
have
what
been
was impressive was that it could be put on a barge and floated down, let's say, the Rhine in the Germanies to another community if they were having trouble in one community. Also in Holland this happened. It was easily movable. And later, as machines got more and more cumbersome, it wasn't as easily movable. But one point that I learned as I was working on this was that the wooden hand press gave way to the iron hand press, which was a very useful implement for the radical printers of the early 19th century in England. It didn't have to be harnessed to steam. The iron press, and I've got a cartoon in my book of the iron press as a rebel, so to speak, because it was extremely useful for the artisans who were rebelling, well, the Chartists and others. But that doesn't, maybe not entirely to your point.
That'll do for today.
Wait a minute. Oh, yes.
I've often wondered what print runs were like in those days, the wooden press. How many books
Well, it
were
varies.
produced? Does anybody, it varies.
The very beginning, 200 was quite 200 to 1,000. From let's say the 1450s to the 1550s would be more or less the range. Oh, Georgiana's gone. There's somebody else from the Folger who knows more about this than I do here, I'm sure. Well, that's,
Next
you
question.
know more than I do.
I don't, no, I don't, I'm sure. I've often mentioned, though, that Gutenberg sort of enabled Martin Luther. That is to say, he made the book cheap. Luther wanted to get the word to the common man, so he could do his own
Well,
thing.
that's a question.
Okay, well, I understood you to say that Luther sort of acknowledged this.
Oh, well, he did say that he said, but he said he did curse printers too. Everybody did, the printer, but not the art. He did say it was, how did he put it? He did say it enabled him to succeed where John Huss and John Wycliffe and others had not succeeded. And he did call it God's highest act of grace somewhere.
Do you have a reference for that? Where did you say this? Which?
Could be in her book, I think.
It's
In her book, she's got thousands of notes and references, so
Okay.
literally.
Next question? Here's one.
Yes, I was wondering if you could speak, you mentioned eloquence and persuasion. I was wondering if you could speak to the printing press and rhetoric as a discipline, and maybe the decline of rhetoric as a discipline with the rise of the printing press and the rise of publications, and perhaps an opposition between rhetoric as an oral discipline and the printing press, and how that changed things.
Well, that's interesting because I found in the 17th and 18th, especially in the 18th century, there's a great, in the French Academy, there's a lot going on about eloquence, which had been valued. Eloquence in the part of a preacher or on the part of a speaker was a way of moving crowds. It was an extremely important element. But by the 18th century, there was beginning to be a question about the advantages of speech as against the advantages, the disadvantage of hearing a rabble-rouser or a preacher and rushing out, as mobs are doing, right, of rushing out to take action as opposed to reading and thinking and going over a text, which encouraged reflection and calm consideration. This was, but one point John Adams makes actually in his comments on Condorcet. There's a wonderful book about John Adams' marginalia by somebody who lived in, he was in the Boston Athenaeum, librarian, what's his name, Zoltan Horashki. Anyway, he collected all of John Adams' marginal comments on Condorcet's sketch for the progress of the human mind. And Adams gets madder and madder and madder at Condorcet. And one of the things he says, "You fool, what about Marat? What about all these revolutionary journalists who are inciting people to do all sorts of things? It isn't the medium at all. It's the message." He didn't say that because he didn't know what but his point was that in print, you can incite people, you can stir people, you can stir their emotions just as much as you do in preaching. And of course, this was, the 18th century novels were engaged in touching people's hearts, in moving them to tears, et cetera, so that there was nothing about the medium that prevented you from exciting, stirring people's emotions, as well as appealing to their rational selves. But that was not appreciated by the French academicians, or Benjamin Franklin has some very interesting things to say about this. He objected strenuously to teaching elocution and eloquence, but of course he'd never gone to college and never had been brainwashed.
Take two more questions. This lady has one, please. Yeah.
I have a quick one for you. I recently read a biography of Martin Luther, and their point there was that there are many of these disgruntled editorials that were tacked up on the walls, on the doors of churches. I mean, but he would have been just another, and mostly complaining about the controversy of the day, which was indulgences, the sale of indulgences, which Martin Luther and many others like him thought was immoral.
That's one of my pet points.
Yes, yes.
That I talk about non-books, and the most important non-book is the indulgence, because they just couldn't be printed. I mean, they couldn't be copied out in the quantities that they came off the press. And
well, yeah, and to follow up on that Martin Luther would have remained a monastic, a quiet monk and never be known to history, except that it just so happened that Wittenberg, which by the way is arguably the church that he nailed his piece up onto, it's probably a small church.
There's an argument about whether he nailed it or mailed it.
Or whether it was even that church or in fact the small church in which he was a resident. But the point was that Wittenberg was just a few miles from Mainz, and it took place in about 70 years.
This lady is maintained on one of my favorite themes actually, about the effectiveness of Martin Luther's protests, and the fact that converting his protest. I mean, if you've ever looked at the 95 Theses in Latin, they just don't send you right out to do anything. He converted. He really attracted a whole group of printers who knew how to sell his product, so to speak, and went from door to door, actually, with printed materials. And I think it's fair to say that that's an old theme, I might add, that printing. What the point I've tried to make is that within the Protestant mindset, printing has a very special place because of its emancipatory action, which is not true within the Catholic mindset. This doesn't mean that Catholics didn't print. There's a new books come out all the time about the enormous amount of, the very term propaganda comes from the Catholic Church, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faithful. And Catholics were very capable of using, and after all, Luther himself was a Catholic monk to begin with, and printing had been exploited by the church well before Luther. So, but nevertheless, printing was not given an ideological component of emancipation of the same kind until after the Lutheran revolt.
Thank you. One last question. Thank you.
I would like to know, just out of curiosity, your title, Divine Art, Infernal Machine. In the first decades after the printing press is there evidence of any author choosing to keep his or her text in manuscript? Or did all authors embrace the printing text?
That's a good question. Certainly, the hand-copied book goes. This was a question of whether all authors embraced printing right away. And a lot of them continued to use scribes. There are many scholars, since I wrote my book, who have found whole, right down to the 18th century, circles of scribes who were copying. Especially in England, poetry was considered infra dig. If you were a lord and you published your poetry, you printed your poetry. Instead, you had, but I mean, even now I get books of poetry that are sort of private press books of poetry. There's something about giving your poetry to a coterie of friends rather than printing it for the world. I haven't really worked this out completely. And it wasn't true in France, and it wasn't true in Italy, where there were famous printers who printed Ronsard, the French circle of poets were printed early on. And of course, Petrarch was printed as soon as the printing press could. But hand-copied books continued if you wanted, for instance, like the mimeograph, the samizdat that the Russians used, if you wanted clandestine circulation of your material, you might very well resort to hand copying. But I don't think there are many authors who had their prose works copied by hand when they wanted others to read them.
Thank you. Betty, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I will say that Betty is still much in demand.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.